Today we're debating whether or not Jesus existed, and we are starting right now. Ladies and gentlemen, thrilled to have you here for this epic debate today as we're going to have a triple threat match. We have an atheist with us, a Christian with us, and I'm updating it in the title, we have a heathen with us, and we'll let Calon explain exactly where she stands regarding her position in just a moment. Want to let you know, if this is your first time here, consider hitting that subscribe button. We are very excited for a lot of debates that you might want reminders of. Just as a quick example, this is one that we had just booked, and it's a wild one, folks. It's crazy. It's Matt Dillahunty and Mike Jones from Inspiring Philosophy will be debating in January in person on the reasons to believe in God's existence. That'll be live streamed right here. So we are pumped for that. And hit that notification bell if you want a reminder for debates like those. Also, want to let you know, forgot to mention, I'm going to tweet this out right now. If you guys want to help by spreading the word on Twitter or on Discord, wherever it is, Facebook, we are actually going to have 100% of all of the super chats will be going to child burn victims today. So the Child Burn Foundation, which I've just put in the description, they have excellent ratings from Charity Navigator, which is basically a charity watchdog. They just make sure that the funds are going to where the organizations say that they're going to. And so we are very excited, as that will be it's a very good cause that we're excited to give to. So with that, all of our speakers are linked in the description. So highly encourage you, if you're listening today and you're like, I like that, I want more, you can find more right in that little description box down there. Their links are linked below. And with that, thanks for being here, atheist pastor Jonathan or McLatchie and Calon. It's a pleasure to have all of you. So I guess what we'll do is kind of open the floor just in case anybody does. We'll let each of you take as long as you want, like a flexible 2 to 5 minutes, and just kind of laying out where you stand on this particular question of where or whether or not Jesus existed. And so I guess we'll go from left to right. So, atheist pastor, if you want to start, the floor is all yours.
Sounds good. Good day, everyone, and good morning from Australia. It's a challenge to get up at 7 a.m. where I am, so it's a miracle that you've got me. So maybe that is proof of something divine. So my position is I don't believe that there was a historical person called Jesus. Obviously, being an atheist, I don't hold that the Christian Gospels are accurate or a true representation of a deity. This can be a challenging topic, I guess, for a lot of people, especially if you're coming at it from a Christian worldview, because it's something that will definitely challenge your beliefs. So, what I would ask everyone is to apply the same kind of historical, I guess, reasoning that we would apply to any other historical figure to this. So, looking at primary sources, secondary sources, and evaluating it from there. So, that's the very brief overview of where I stand, and I'm happy to pass the mic.
You bet. Jonathan, if you'd like to go next. Oh, I think we got you on mute. Let me see if I.
Sorry about that. I
No
was on
problem.
mute. Well, thanks. It's great to be here. Thankful for Chris and Calon for coming on to discuss this important topic. I'm Jonathan McLatchie. I am a Christian, and I am a Christian because I am persuaded by the public evidence that Christianity is objectively true. I think that the scientific evidence for the existence of God is overwhelming. And I think the evidence for the historicity of Jesus of Nazareth is very, very compelling, as is the evidence for his resurrection from the dead. And so that's some of the reasons why I'm a Christian. I am persuaded that the Gospels are substantially reliable reports and biographies of the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth. We also have so there's that testimony of the historical existence of Jesus Christ. We also have the testimony of the book of Acts, which is a sequel to the Gospel of Luke. Luke, of course, was a traveling companion of Paul, and he also, of course, affirms that Jesus was an historical person. We also have the epistles of Paul. There's 13 letters written by the Apostle Paul, who was who was not a disciple of Jesus, but he was a companion of many of the people who knew Jesus personally. He was in particular a companion of Jesus' own biological brother, James, and Jesus' closest disciple, Peter. And of course, Paul affirms that Jesus was an historical person. And so that too is quite compelling evidence for the historical existence of Jesus of Nazareth. And I'm sure we'll get into those and unpack them in more detail as the discussion progresses.
You bet. Thank you very much. And Calon, thanks for being here. First time, I think.
Yeah, it is my first time. I'm glad to be here. My position is that Yeshua, which is Jesus in Aramaic, Jesus kind of actually sounds pretty weird to me when you say it because, well, just etymological reasons. But anyhow, I hold that the secular, the hostile sources, so to speak, which are the sources who are writing sort of not from a Christian viewpoint, are sufficient within combination of other historical evidence, such as the arisal of various sects of Christianity and whatnot, to establish that there was more than likely some person who originally had some teachings whom we call Jesus. And therefore, Jesus is a historical character.
You bet. Thank you. Appreciate that. And with that, we'll just go right into the open dialogue. So thanks again for being here.
Cool. So one thing I actually want to clear up that you just said, Jonathan, you mentioned that there's eyewitness testimony, but one thing that the historical evidence actually shows is there's actually no contemporary testimony at all. The earliest writings on Jesus being the epistles of Paul, which were from the sort of roughly the 50s AD. And of the epistles, you mentioned 13, but only 7 of them are historically viewed by the majority of scholars as being authentic. So there's 2 that are certainly up in the air. It's a bit of a split as to whether they're authentic or not, but there's certainly not all 13 that are attributed to Paul were written by Paul. So that's probably the first thing that I would clarify, and I'm happy to have that conversation.
Can we discuss that and then move on to the next point?
Sure.
Okay. So in the first point, we have to be careful to define what we actually mean by a contemporary source. Do we mean a source that was written during the life of Jesus of Nazareth, or do we mean a source that was written by someone who lived during the time of Jesus of Nazareth?
I think for the sake of the discussion, I would probably use the same level that you would for any kind of primary source historically.
So for example,
at the time, I was so something that was an actual witness to the event, not a second hand.
So you mean a primary source, basically?
Quite literally a primary source. If it's a primary source, I would accept that as evidence.
Well, okay.
But you don't accept secondary resources.
Well, it depends on the quality of the secondary resource. There's secondary resources and there's secondary resources.
So do you know how many sources from the first century mention Josephus?
From the first century mentioned Josephus.
Yeah.
Well, Josephus, his writings were in the 90s, I believe. So they probably wouldn't. Right. I couldn't give you an exact number, but his histories were in the 90s. So, well, it wouldn't be 0 because his book was published in the 90s. So it was.
No, he wrote. I mean, we have his own testimony that he existed. We don't have any contemporaries of Josephus that mention that he existed, but nonetheless, we know he existed. So clearly, even if that were the case, which it isn't in the case of Jesus of Nazareth. If there were no contemporaries that wrote about his existence, that would not be an argument for him not existing.
Well, the writings of Josephus would be considered a primary source, same as the writings of Herodotus would be considered a primary source.
So the Gospel of John, for example, the Gospel of John is written, I would argue, by a disciple of Jesus. I would
argue against that because the historical dating actually puts that in the 2nd century. So if he was a disciple of Jesus, then he'd be over 100 years old probably at the time he wrote it.
Okay. What's the historical evidence puts it in the 2nd century?
Well, there's absolutely nothing that would indicate it was written in the 1st century.
What's the evidence that it was written in the 2nd century?
The evidence that was written in the 2nd century, but there's absolutely nothing from the 1st century that references
I think what we're also asking for here is what sort of linguistic evidence could you establish that shows that these texts were not written? Like, languages tend to evolve and change over time. So if, for example, if the Gospels were all written in modern Greek, we would be able to date it to present day. So what about the Gospels in terms of like linguistic structure and whatnot, make it to where it couldn't have been written in these centuries.
Well, it's yeah. No, well, it was written in Greek. It was written in the Greek at the time, and there is evidence from the 2nd century that the Gospel of John existed in the 2nd century. I know there is some contention. I'll say that possibly
So it would
could
have had to have been
late first
before the
century.
2nd century.
No. If the
If it
earliest
was in the 2nd century.
if the earliest manuscripts we've got and the earliest references to
does
it are
not
from the
follow.
2nd century.
I mean, the earliest manuscripts of Cornelius Tacitus' Annals of Imperial Rome are not to like 1000 AD. So does that make Tacitus writing in 1000 AD?
No, well, Tacitus, his writings are from 117. There is actually earlier
Right, but we don't have manuscripts
copies of Tacitus.
We don't have copies of Tacitus from the 2nd century. We only have about 2 manuscripts from Tacitus on which Annals of Imperial Rome is based.
Yeah, but we do have referencing to Tacitus and his writings.
But we also have references, and we have references to John in the 2nd century. But John was writing around 80.
I'm not arguing.
So
I'm not arguing the 2nd century. And look,
Right,
I'm even willing to concede late 1st century, because there is some contention between scholars that it could be anywhere sort of between about 90 and 120. But
so if you concede 1st century, then
look,
let's say
I'll put it this way: if you guys can provide me with evidence that there is writings from or the Book of John was written in the 1st century, I'm happy to.
Well,
show me the evidence.
you've already conceded that it was probably written in the 1st century. So
no, I haven't.
That would be within. I thought you did.
I haven't conceded that at all. No. I said that there is some contention that it may have been written in the 1st century, the late 1st century, in the 90s. But the general consensus is that from historian, it is. I'm telling you, it is.
No, it's not.
It is.
The consensus dating for the Gospel of John is between 1995 CE.
So 90 and 95 C. Okay.
Right.
For the sake of this argument.
Which would put us within 100 years of Jesus's death.
For the sake of this argument, I am happy to say 90 to 95 CE, because there is some contention about that. I did say that. But even then, still, we're talking 60 years after the death of someone who, in a time where people lived to be an average age of 50. So what age would that put John at?
So we have evidence of people living much longer. We have evidence of people living longer. For example, Josephus was born in 37 he was born in 37 AD and he died around 180. So Josephus lived to be fairly old.
An average age isn't a cap.
Yeah, Polycarp of Smyrna also, he famously said in the letter of the Smyrnaean church documenting his martyrdom, he says, 86 years have I served Christ, and he never did me any wrong. How then can I blaspheme my King and Savior? So people, I mean, the average life expectancy is significantly depleted by the high infant mortality rate.
No, that's not correct. The average lifespan for a surviving adult in that era was around about 48 to 50 years. That's for a surviving adult. So that's taking infant mortality rates out of it.
What's your source?
Actually, that's directly from Richard Carrier. I'd have to check his source.
Okay. Oh yeah, I need to look at the source. But in any case, we have evidences of individuals living much longer. I mean, Josephus, 37, 180. So it's not an argument. In any case, you can even argue. I mean, there's a minority of scholars that argue for an earlier dating of John. Like Daniel Wallace, for example, puts John in the 50s AD. And I think that there's some good arguments for putting it at least pre-70. For example, in John chapter 5 and verse 2, we read, now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which is 5 roofed colonnades. Notice it uses the present tense. There are 5 colonnades by the sheep gate. And those colonnades, along with the entire temple complex, were destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. So
I'd have to check the original source for that, but yeah.
And the original source is John chapter 5, verse 2.
Yeah, but in the original context it was written. I don't know that verse off the top of my head.
Okay, but there's a case to be made for dating John much earlier
and there is a small amount of scholars that will say it was possibly earlier, but even then, I mean,
it still puts us within 1 to 2 generations of Jesus, of a historical figure of Jesus.
Yeah, but one to 2 generations that's not an eyewitness account. That doesn't
I
represent an
mean,
eyewitness account.
neither does anything we have about George Washington. I mean, or many other historical figures. How are you going to deny that Jesus exists, but Alexander the Great does exist?
There's primary sources relating to George Washington. Absolutely, there's records. The British,
but what about Alexander the Great?
Record keepers. Alexander the Great.
Let me ask.
The Greeks were actually they're probably the worst example to use, because the Greeks of that era were actually very good record keepers.
So they were good record keepers, but I mean, yeah, they were good record keepers, but the evidence for Alexander the Great's existence isn't exactly that plentiful from that area. How do you know it wasn't just many other different leaders who made the conquest up to India?
Well, the evidence wouldn't suggest that. The evidence, there's primary source evidence that suggests that this person exists.
Which primary source?
Well, there's coins with his head on it for a start. That's a great.
There are coins with the heads of the gods who you deny that are on it. Does that mean the gods exist?
No, that would be primary source evidence that the gods were acknowledged at the time. There's a difference between acknowledging gods and a person.
Right.
But did Alexander the Great exist? Evidence says that. Does it really affect this argument, or does it really affect my view on things? No, probably not. But there is writings that the Greeks of that era. It's a little bit earlier, but the histories of Herodotus. I mean, that gives us an in-depth look at the Peloponnesian War, which eventually led to the rise of Macedonia.
Was Herodotus during Alexander's life? Was he a primary witness?
He was just before, actually. So no, he wasn't. He was prior to Alexander's life, and it was the Peloponnesian War that led to the eventual rise of Macedonia as the great power.
That's an inference there. That's not a historical eyewitness account.
Of what? Alexander the Great? No, it's prior to it. I didn't say it was.
Right. So what's your evidence using Memphis' standards of history that Alexander the Great exists?
I'm not here arguing for the existence of Alexander the Great. We're talking about Jesus.
Right, but you're using
it makes
no
history. I know bits and pieces.
You have about the same amount of evidence for Alexander the Great that we do for Jesus.
I know that atheist pastor is getting a lot of challenge, which is good. We just want for sure to be. I want to make sure you get plenty of time to respond, atheist pastor.
Yeah, look, it's. I haven't come here prepared. I know bits and pieces. My area of history isn't Alexander the Great. I'm not here prepared to defend Alexander the Great. I don't have evidence or enough evidence that I can quote you for Alexander the Great. So I can't really lend to that discussion. I can lend to the discussion of Jesus, because that's what I've come here prepared to discuss.
Okay.
Same as I couldn't discuss George Washington because I don't study American history. There's a lot of, you can throw a million names out there. We're not here to discuss them. We're here to discuss.
Except the
Jesus.
Question isn't about those historical figures. The question is, how can you know that those historical figures existed, but yet deny somehow for some sort of special pleading cause that Jesus doesn't exist?
Well, with Alexander the Great, no, I can't, because I haven't researched it. I don't have any evidence because I haven't gone looking for the evidence.
Okay, let me ask you a question to bring it back to the New Testament. How do you respond to unexplained allusions that appear in the Gospels? For instance, in Mark chapter 15, verse 21. This is when Jesus is being led to his execution site. And it says, they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. Here are Alexander and Rufus, right? They're just name dropped in the narrative there in Mark. It suggests that the original audience knew who they are, even though we do not. That sort of unexplained allusion, I would argue, is a hallmark of verisimilitude. Would you not agree?
No.
Why?
No, I wouldn't agree.
Why?
Because it mentions two people in a book that was written. I mean, Mark was probably, I guess, to historically date that. Would you be happy to say it's the late 60s, early 70s?
I would say that it's actually, I would date Mark to the 50s, but it's neither here nor there. I'm non-committal on the dating, and I don't think it's relevant to the argument.
Once again, it's a book that's written after it mentions that two people carried a cross. Okay.
No mention of Simon
The Bible says a lot of things.
There was in the incidental detail that's not relevant to the story in any way that he was the father of Alexander and Rufus, who are evidently known or presumably known to the original audience. And so it seems that it's almost an invitation for the original audience to go and check it out with Alexander and Rufus.
Well, what if there was two people called Alexander and Rufus who wanted to insert themselves in the story, so they made their father this great hero who carried a cross? We don't know. That's the point. I'm not suggesting that's what happened, but we don't know. I mean, we're talking about something was written years after.
On that hypothesis, you would expect Alexander and Rufus to feature in some narrative in the story, but they're just name dropped. Like we're supposed to know who they are.
Maybe they were leaders of churches back then. Who knows? I'm just throwing. It's a hypothetical. You're asking for why would that be? Well, I'm giving you an example of why that could be.
Okay, I mean, the evidence for the substantial reliability of the Gospels is a cumulative argument. There's so many different lines of evidence that converge on the conclusion that the Gospels are based on eyewitness testimony and that they are substantially trustworthy.
If they're trustworthy, why are there contradictions?
For example?
The genealogy of Jesus in Luke and Matthew is the obvious one.
So I view the genealogy in Luke as the genealogy of Mary, and the genealogy in Matthew is the genealogy of Joseph. And there's
why would they do that? That wasn't the tradition at the time. There would be no reason for them to do that.
In any case, even leaving that aside, I mean, we can even aside from that, we can demonstrate that the Gospels are at least minimally reliable to establish the existence of Jesus.
No, I disagree.
Yes, we can.
No, we can't.
So,
and that's where we're at. And look, you and I can sit back and go, yes, we can, no, we can't, yes, we can, no, we can't. And we're not going to get anywhere. I'd rather discuss. Look, I'll ask you this.
So let's. I mean, you want to get into specifics? We can get into specifics. So, for example, take John chapter 6. This is the feeding of the 5,000 miracle, and we get to verse 5, and it says, lifting up his eyes and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so these people may eat?" Immediately raises a question in the mind of the audience. Why does Jesus turn to Philip here in particular? Because Philip's a fairly minor character in the Gospels. Why not say Judas Iscariot, who's in charge of the money bag, or someone like that? If you go over 6 chapters later to John chapter 12, we learn that Philip is from a certain town called Bethsaida. Just incidental detail, completely different context from John 6. In Luke's account, Luke chapter 9, Luke also tells about the feeding of the 5,000. And he doesn't mention that Jesus turns to Philip in that context at all. It just says he spoke to the disciples. But it does mention Bethsaida as the setting of the miracle story, which then explains and illuminates John 6:5, that Jesus turned to Philip to ask to send people to buy bread because Philip's a local guy. He knows where the shops are to buy bread. So by putting pieces together from Luke 9, from John 6, from John 12, we can come up with a cogent explanation for why Jesus turns to Philip in John 6:5. How would you explain that on the mythicist hypothesis?
So what you're saying is John that was written potentially, we'll argue on the dates, but John was written after Luke. I don't think we'll argue that. So a story in John expands on a story in Luke. Okay, well, Matthew expands on Mark. And
no, that's not the point. In John chapter 6, there's no mention
I'm trying to work out what the point is. It's you're saying that there was, John goes into more detail about something that happened in Luke. So what? That proves nothing. It just proves that it's an expansion on a story.
No, in John 6, there's no mention of Bethsaida setting the miracle story, but Philip is mentioned as the person to whom Jesus turns to ask where to send people to buy bread. And John 6 doesn't even mention Bethsaida as Philip's hometown. That's in John 12. And it's only in Luke 9 that doesn't mention Philip in that context at all. It mentions the event takes place at Bethsaida. That sort of pattern, that sort of interlocking of different sources is best explained on the historicist hypothesis rather than on the mythicist hypothesis.
No, I disagree. I don't think that actually goes to. I don't even think that goes to the point that of what we're discussing. It's an expansion of a. It's basically there's 2 different versions of a similar story. One goes into details about one. So what? That doesn't prove anything.
Well, even if I grant that there's a contradiction, many, if not almost every historical document from around that time contradicts itself. Like, that's one thing about all of these texts, is that the way when they were written, people weren't so much focused on recording the history for in and of itself, but rather of also sort of adding their own touches to it. so to speak.
Well, that
And
could.
so I
think that's true of any writing.
I don't necessarily see any issue with having a contradiction at all, because again, we would have to throw out a huge amount of our historical record if we were to say, oh, there's a contradiction, guess we got to give up now.
Right. I completely agree with what Calon has said, because there's historical contradictions in many ancient reports, but that doesn't mean that they're substantially unreliable. So
no, it doesn't. It doesn't, but it also doesn't go to prove. Look, with the existence of Jesus, the burden of proof.
You keep using this word proof. What do you mean by historical proof here?
Well, can I finish what I was going to say?
All right, go ahead.
What I'm trying. Sorry. So when it comes to it's not up to me to prove that Jesus didn't exist. If you guys provide me with evidence he did, I'm happy to accept it. The burden of proof is on you making the claim that he existed. And from what I can see, looking at it from a purely historical point of view, as a historian, the evidence doesn't stack up. There's no primary sources. There's no contemporary sources. The earliest writings we have are
there are sources within the first. They're the sources within the first 2 generations.
Okay, so could I write an eyewitness account of World War II?
If you were in World War II and you were old enough, sure. Well, then you can go and you can interview, and it would be called a secondary source.
Absolutely, and that's what I'm saying, that these sources.
Do you know how much history is actually built off of secondary sources?
Yes, I do.
So do you reject all secondary sources?
No, I don't.
So why do you reject these secondary sources?
I'm not saying I reject secondary sources, but secondary sources, there's different standards of secondary sources, and you need to look at, because secondary sources are such a broad, there's such a broad range, you can't evaluate all secondary sources as equal. The same as you can't evaluate all primary sources as being equal. You've got to actually evaluate the source in the context for when it was written and what it was. I mean,
and these sources have been
a secondary source on Jesus could be something that's written today. That could be a scholarly secondary source.
No, it couldn't be, because at this point you would be writing from texts, which are, and there would be a tertiary resource, if anything.
Right.
No. If I were to go and source a journal article from this year on
the only way it could be a secondary resource is if you had an eyewitness account.
1 second, just to be sure that he gets to finish.
No, I absolutely disagree, and I think you'll find the majority of historians would not hold to that.
I mean, the Gospel of Luke is a secondary source, because Luke was not an eyewitness to Jesus. He was an eyewitness to Paul and was a traveling companion to Paul. He was not an eyewitness to Jesus, but he was personally acquainted with people who were eyewitnesses. And so Luke is a secondary source. But then if someone were to write a source that was and he'd got his information from Luke, then that would be a tertiary source, and so forth.
Okay, right. No, I think no, it's different definitions. I'd say it's different definitions. Maybe it's a different thing I doubt it's different in the US and Australia, but a secondary source for me and where I study and the way we look at it is anything that's not a primary source, anything that anything that would be a journal article, anything that would be a book that would be written, we would class as a secondary source. But there's certainly different types of secondary sources, and that's what I'm saying needs to be evaluated. You couldn't evaluate.
What is your standard for a secondary resource to prove that Jesus exists? Historically, we're talking historical.
If I had a standard to prove that Jesus existed, I'd be arguing on the other side.
You do, because basic philosophy states that you're making the claim that the metaphysical position that Jesus doesn't exist. That's a claim. You need to back that up.
I'm making the claim that I haven't been provided with adequate evidence.
So what you're saying is you're agnostic on Jesus.
Hold on, one second. Just to be sure that Atheist Pastor gets a chance to respond.
You can define it however you want. I'm not too fussed. It doesn't change my view. I don't believe that there's evidence that Jesus existed, and I believe that the lack of evidence would probably indicate that he didn't.
What do you mean by evidence? Because it seems that there is a distinction between saying no evidence and insufficient evidence.
Well,
I mean, I don't think even Carrier would maintain there's no evidence.
No, of course not. But you've got to evaluate the evidence that you've got there, and there's no contemporary evidence. There is nothing for at least 20 years. I mean, even the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Essenes, they didn't mention anything about Jesus, and they were contemporary at the time. There's no contemporary sources. The what's written in the Bible about the character of Pilate is very different from other sources, or what other sources would indicate about the character of Pilate. For instance, there's a 20-year gap, and there's no explanation for the 20-year gap, and even that 20-year gap, the first writing is from Paul, who wasn't an eyewitness. So the gospel, if the Gospel of Mark, which would be, let's say, the Gospel of Mark, I think it's pretty much agreed is the earliest of the Gospels. That is the first actual writing claimed to be about the life of Jesus, and that is in the 70s. So we're talking 30 to 40 years after. And I know you say the 50s, but even if I were to grant you that, and it was still 20 years, there is still a gap with absolutely no contemporary sources or writings for the person who is supposedly the greatest human to ever exist. That
the same is true. I mean, there's no contemporary sources that speak about Josephus. There, Alexander the Great. There, the earliest extant biographers of Alexander the Great were Arrian and Plutarch, who lived some 300 years after Alexander the Great passed away.
Yep, there seems to be this sort of inconsistency within Mythicist's position, his historiography.
I'm not making any claim either way about Alexander the Great.
It's just you're being inconsistent.
Hold on, one second. Just forgive me. So sorry. I just want to make sure Atheist Pastor gets to kind of the full time to respond, because it's challenging where it's like I kind of, in a way, to try to keep it relatively fair, McLatchie and Calon, you guys are in the tough spot of, to some extent, having a split time. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I'm not making any claim about Alexander the Great. I haven't researched Alexander the Great. That's not my area of history. I am happy to research Alexander the Great and have a look and come back to you with my conclusion there. But I mean, you can throw any name from history. At the end of the day, if I haven't researched it, I can't comment on it. I'm not going to comment on something that I have no knowledge on and pretend I'm an expert.
No, but the point is that your argument against the historical Jesus is that there's a time gap of 20 years between Jesus' death and the first written records of him. But when it comes to someone like Alexander the Great, whom you take for granted existed, the earliest extant biographies are some 300 years after his death.
I'm banging my head against the wall here. I'm not making any position on that. If you guys want to schedule a debate about Alexander the Great, awesome, let's do that. Let's make it in a week's time, and I'll do the research. I don't have a position on Alexander the Great. I have not researched Alexander the Great. I know bits and pieces from basic history about Alexander the Great. I'm not having a position on whether he existed or not. I have no position because I haven't done the research.
What about Caesar
I'm not
Augustus?
here to argue it. Sorry?
Okay, so there's also Caesar Augustus, Caesar Augustus. Would you deny that he exists? Who do you know that in the ancient world, aside from this Jesus mythicism stuff, that you hold does not exist, but that does exist, but there is not as much evidence, or the evidence is also secondary?
Secondary evidence? Well, if
secondary sources.
I wouldn't really hold any. I'm sorry, I'm not. So you're saying using only secondary sources, who would I say existed in history?
Ancient history.
Because
history. This is what we're ultimately discussing.
Okay. I would have said Pilate, but I believe I believe there is actually primary sources for the existence of Pilate. I really couldn't tell you off the top of my head. I couldn't tell you. I'd have to look in and I mean, there's. Yeah, no, I wouldn't.
So, what do you know about ancient history?
Well, which area of ancient history? It's a big thing. I mean,
we're talking Rome. We're talking Rome pretty much here. Rome,
ancient Rome. I'm not an expert on ancient Rome.
Okay.
But I'm not here to discuss ancient Rome. I'm here to discuss.
Well, no, this is ultimately an extension of ancient Rome and what happened in ancient Rome with the rise of Christianity. It's very related. So the other thing also is the 20-year gap doesn't actually even seem to be that much of a problem here, because we're also dealing in a society which isn't exactly, literacy isn't the highest thing. So if everyone knows about Jesus already, then they're going to use it through oral communication. If it's through oral communication and only like the church to get things started up, then yeah, there's no need to write anything down. So that's not exactly a compelling dismissal of that evidence.
Everything else got written down at the time. There's
No.
the records around that era are actually pretty decent.
Yeah, by the elite class.
Okay.
Not by, because contrary to popular belief, most Romans, and probably most Romans who were able to write stuff usually came from noble families. It was not it's not like how they like to portray it in the movies. It was a very stratified society. Most Romans were illiterate.
Yeah, I'm not going to argue that. I don't know
And
enough
so-
about it, so I'm not going to argue it. I wouldn't doubt that I would imagine that would be correct.
So why would they write something down if they're trying to appeal to the common person who is illiterate?
Why are they trying to appeal to the common person?
To spread religion, Christianity as a religion spread.
Then why bother writing it down 30 years later?
Because
Literacy rates didn't
changed.
suddenly jump up in 30 years.
Because circumstances changed. People got convinced, and people who were literate eventually got convinced, and they decided, it's time to write this stuff down.
Okay,
Time to iron out the philosophy and combine it with Platonism and whatever.
Yeah, it's no.
Further,
you're applying this. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, furthermore, we have evidence of sources concerning the life of Jesus that predate the Gospels. For example, in Luke chapter 1, Luke opens his Gospel by saying, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught." So that implies that there were sources concerning Jesus' life predating
Mark and Matthew for a start, plus the epistles of written by Paul.
Well, he says many.
They all predate Luke.
But he says, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, it suggests that there were sources concerning the life of Jesus which are now lost to us, that we no longer have today.
Well, and the ones that were thrown out by the church in the early days, there was a lot of different gospels and a lot of different takes on Jesus. There was a lot of different narratives. I mean, you only need to look at the Gnostics, which were, I can say, well after Luke.
Right, well after,
well after. But well, I mean,
after.
that's just to use an example. There was no shortage of people writing about Jesus. But I mean, if we're just to go off the biblical side of things, well, you've got the Pauline epistles, which were obviously written to the various churches, of which I would argue 7 of which, and most historians would agree that 7 of which are actually attributed to Paul, with a couple in the grey and a few that probably weren't, but even those potentially were written prior, just not by Paul. You've got Mark, you've got Matthew. I'm not arguing that people were writing about Jesus prior to Luke. I think that the evidence would suggest that is fairly the case.
Okay, so let's talk about Paul, since you mentioned Paul. I mean, Paul has a lot to say about Jesus, and he was closely associated with Jesus' brother James and Jesus' close disciple Peter. So are the writings of Paul not substantial evidence that Jesus existed?
No, he wasn't an eyewitness, and he never claims. Okay, in Galatians 1, he says that the knowledge that he was given wasn't from people; it was from revelation.
Okay.
James, the brother, that's not the actual brother as in we would. The term that we would use for brother, as in a biological brother. That's as in the you're my brother, as in a Christian brother. Things
you
like
realize that's a very French minority position, don't you? I'm not aware of anyone who argues that outside of mythicist circles.
Okay, I have actually heard that. I've heard that. I heard that argued when I was studying theology, in a Christian setting.
So. In Galatians chapter 1, he says, "But I saw none of the other apostles except..." So he says, start from verse 18. "And after 3 years I went out to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and remained with him 15 days. So Cephas is Peter. "But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother." So he calls James the Lord's brother so as to distinguish him from Peter, who was not the Lord's brother. But if he's using brother in a generic sense, then he would also refer to Cephas as the Lord's brother.
Well, it depends on. You didn't just no, because there was the baptism and leadership structure. So that's you you can't have your cake and eat it too on that. It's people didn't just become a Christian and instantly become a brother. There was a period that they went through. It's like for lack of a better term, an initiation before they were baptized. And then at that point, when they were in leadership, they were considered a brother. The same as you've got brothers within the Catholic Church now, or, father, or, it doesn't literally mean a father. It's more a rank or an authoritative position.
You also have, you have the reference to the brothers of Jesus in the Gospels and the book of Acts, including James, who becomes leader of the Jerusalem church in Acts 15. We also have the reference to Jesus' brothers in 1 Corinthians 9, where he says that do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas. So the brothers of the Lord is it seems to me to be most plausibly understood as the biological brothers. But even leaving that aside, even granting that point, it's still incontrovertible that the Apostle Paul was personally acquainted with those who personally knew Jesus of Nazareth, including Jesus' closest disciple Peter, right?
Well, he was acquainted with, or he claims to have been acquainted with, Peter and the apostles, but there's a difference between apostles and disciples as well.
Well, even if he wasn't, he's still within the time of Jesus. That's the other thing.
Well, no, it was after. That was
he was alive during.
Paul never met Jesus.
But he was a contemporary.
No, he was a contemporary of Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely, he was.
So he would have been. Yeah. He would have heard about this Jesus guy who's around, and he would have met people who are even just sort of, even maybe not disciples, but just common folk, and they would tell him about this guy named Jesus, and that would be in itself a primary source for Paul to work on. That states that the proposition
he denies that.
Yeah, he can deny it all he wants. The facts of living in Judea may change that.
Well, we can't use him as a primary source if he's denying it. I mean, if he's saying that it was all everything he knows about Jesus is through revelation. That's I
don't see any reason why not. I don't see any reason why not. He didn't grow up. He didn't come up in a vacuum. He was in a society that had this person named Jesus who was around preaching. He would have heard of him, even if it was just through word of mouth. So
that's not what he claims, though.
This isn't about what Paul claims. It's about the existence of Jesus.
I've completely lost your point. Sorry.
That Paul would have based his stuff. That Paul didn't make up Jesus because he would have at least heard about Jesus while still being in Judea. And in order for him to hear about Jesus, he would have had to have, how to put this? In order to hear about Jesus, there would have needed to have been some sort of stimulus there, which means that some guy named Jesus, Yeshua, was walking around and preaching.
Yeah, but that's not what Paul claims.
I don't care what Paul. I care about the historicity here. I'm not. Okay, but I'm not debating what Paul said. Paul can say whatever he wants.
You're making assertions based on what Paul knew, which is different from what Paul claims. I mean,
does Paul not mention Jesus?
Yes, he does, but he also says that it was through divine revelation that he learnt about Jesus, not through eyewitness accounts. It was through divine revelation.
It's from divine revelation that he learned the gospel, right? That's in Galatians 1, not about Jesus. So in Galatians chapter 1, it says, "For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached to me is not man's gospel. For I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ." That's not talking about whether Jesus was an historical figure. It's talking about the gospel,
which is the revelation
of Evangelion,
about Christ. Yeah. Okay.
The good news about Jesus. But it's not talking there about whether Jesus was an historical figure or not, because we know that prior to his Acts 9 Damascus Road conversion experience, he was going persecuting Christians. Do you think he had never heard of Jesus before?
I have no idea, because he doesn't mention that he had. But his information about Jesus is through divine revelation. This is the problem with the Bible. It contradicts itself in so many different places. It's hard to keep up with it.
Paul claims on multiple occasions to be personally acquainted with the apostles, and he's not the only person. He's not the only writer that we have that claims this. I mean, the author of Acts, namely Luke, is a traveling companion of Paul and was personally acquainted with the apostles and knew Jesus. So you have, sources that are close up to the facts, and so that is very strong evidence that Jesus existed.
Well, Acts is more of an account of the life of Paul, so it's a history.
But you're missing the point. The point is
I get the point you're making. I just disagree with it.
Okay, but why do you disagree with it?
Because if we're talking about Acts, it's not actually an account of Jesus. That's an account of Paul. I mean, that's an account of Paul's journey to. Now, if I grant that Luke knew Paul, I'm happy to grant that, but that doesn't indicate that he knew any of the disciples, anyone who was an eyewitness.
Well, let's have a look. So Acts 21, for instance, Acts 21, he says, when we'd come to Jerusalem, this is verse 17, when we'd come to Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. The Jerusalem eldership were the apostles. Peter and James are the leaders of the Jerusalem church.
Does it say that?
These are the very...
Does it say that in Acts 21?
It's known historically that Peter and James were the elders of the Jerusalem church, yes.
How? Where?
From the book of Acts. Go to Acts 15, for example.
Okay, but you're quoting Acts 21. What's the time period between Acts 15 and Acts 21?
It's the same author, right? So in
but it didn't all occur in a day. There's a time span that it goes over.
What's your point?
Well, you're saying that you're picking and choosing here. You're saying that it's evidence that they met with Peter, but it doesn't mention Peter. It mentions James. I'm happy to say that they went and they met with James.
And all the brothers are present.
James is a brother who is essentially, as we went over before, I think we've got the disagreement on whether that's biological or as in a title, and that's something that people who have probably researched it a lot more than us are still discussing and arguing. But that doesn't. Once again, none of this is proving any eyewitness accounts of Jesus.
So in Acts 15, it speaks about the Jerusalem Council, verse 6. The apostles and the elders were gathered together to consider this matter, and after there had been much debate, Peter stood up and said to them, brothers, you know that in the early days God made a choice among you, that by my mouth the Gentiles should hear the word of the gospel and believe. And God, who knows the heart, bore witness to them by giving them the Holy Spirit, just as he did to us, etc. And so Peter and James are presented to us as the leaders in the Jerusalem church. In Acts 21, he says that he goes into James and all the brothers are present, indicating that he had personal acquaintance with the apostolic community.
Okay.
And they were.
I'm not arguing that in the 80s or 90s or whenever this is, that
it's
if
totally
Paul was still alive, or Luke or whoever met with the apostles in Jerusalem, I've got no issues with that. There's a difference though between apostles and disciples, where the apostles don't necessarily refer to the 12 disciples who are supposed to have walked around with Jesus. It's the apostles. It's a different thing. It's a common misunderstanding.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Apostles is a broader term, but it's clear that Peter and James were eyewitnesses.
How?
Because of the Gospels and Acts.
Okay, so where are the writings of Peter or the Gospel of Peter?
Well, Peter is thought to be, and there's some quite good evidence for it, and Peter is thought to be the source behind the Gospel of Mark.
Okay. But there's no evidence to that.
Yes, there is.
And look, I'm happy with suggestions, but even then, still, 30 to 35 years later.
Well, I mean, the gospel
20 to 35, somewhere in that.
I mean, the dating of the Gospels is notoriously difficult. I mean, scholars are very divided on when the Gospels are written, so I prefer to be non-committal. So I don't know why you keep coming back to the dating of the Gospels.
Because they're not contemporary. One thing, okay, even if we go off the earliest, even if I were to grant you 20 years, which I don't, but even if I were to, for the sake of the argument, there's a gap. There is an absolute gap between when Jesus of Nazareth would have died and then when anything was written about him, as far as an eyewitness account, excluding,
But we
I'm
already
happy
went
to say,
over.
Yeah,
We already
I
went
know,
over that
I know.
most of the ancient
And
world
we keep coming
was
back to
illiterate.
it. We keep
Yeah,
coming back
because
to
they
it.
were, and also the records aren't, as it turns out, the records that come from that area, come from Jerusalem, are actually pretty shoddy.
According to who?
right. Yeah, it's true.
It's not true.
Like,
Yes, it is.
produce them. Then go, by all means, go ahead and produce the records.
Okay, I'll just pull them out of my back pocket, but that's not the historical
I mean,
consensus at all.
Yes, it is. I'm afraid. I mean,
not. It's
most
not.
of the first century literature has been lost. I mean, the main source for first century Judea is Flavius Josephus. There's also some other first century Jewish writers like Philo of Alexandria. But I mean, the vast majority of what was written in the first century is no longer with us.
It hasn't. The Romans were notoriously good record keepers.
That's what popular imagination thinks. But and while that may have been the case in Roma, which is the capital, when it came to the other parts of the empire, administration could be really shoddy.
Okay,
they were an ancient empire, just like many countless others across the world throughout history. They may have developed the census, but
we are not going to get anywhere if we keep doing the whole yes, no, back and forth. There's things that clearly we're not agreeing on. I'm saying that, and I'm sure we're not going to spend the next 5 hours pulling sources out. I'm happy to provide as many sources as you would like after. I disagree, and I would say that the Romans certainly would have had record of an insurgent who came into Jerusalem and got the whole town into a fit about where they insisted that he be crucified. There would be, I would have to.
No, there wouldn't be. He was a common criminal as far as the Romans were concerned. He's not worthy of the time of consideration. You think the Romans give a damn about criminals?
What I want to do is
I kept records.
We'll be going into the Q&A in just a minute, but I do want to give Atheist Pastor the last word, as it's been I kind of, to be honest, I was worried that sometimes the kind of the heathen and the atheist will kind of team up against the Christian. And so I did not know. So it's been pretty clear that Calon and Jonathan are in agreement in disagreement with Atheist Pastor. So I do want to give you plenty of time, Atheist Pastor, to kind of draw together any of the threads, and then we will go into Q&A.
Sure. Look, I guess I've probably covered most things. I'm happy to go to the Q&A. It's basically my position is there isn't contemporary evidence. There's contemporary evidence of other people existing at the time. There's no contemporary evidence of Jesus. So the burden of proof is on people who claim that he existed to say he existed. What concerns me is that the first writings were at least 20 years later, and they weren't eyewitness accounts. And then the Gospels, at best were 25 years, but probably started around about 35 to 40 years after the character of Jesus would have died. And at a time where, as we've covered, literacy rates weren't high. It's a lot of word of mouth. It's just not a reliable source.
Gotcha. I know that Jonathan and Kellen, you probably have a round in the chamber ready to fire, but I do want to go to Q&A just because we have to stop somewhere. And so thank you all for this really interesting discussion. It's been a true pleasure. And thanks everybody for your donations to the Children's Burn Fund, as I had a lot of good number of super chats come in. And so 100% of those super chats will be going to the Children's Burn Fund. You still have time to fire them out. And also, we cover the 30%. So, YouTube takes their 30% out of the super chats, and we just use past super chats to kind of like fill in that 30%. So literally, if you send a $5 super chat, $5 will be going to the Children's Burn Fund. And with that, we'll jump right into these super chat questions. So thanks for your super chat, Steven Steen. We really appreciate it. He says, James's good looks are absolutely not a myth. Thank you, Stephen. I appreciate that. Really unnecessary. You're married, Stephen. Okay. Thanks for your thanks for your super chat donation from these are a little scrambled, so I promise I'll catch yours if it looks like I'm skipping around. Uh, we did have one. This one looks like it's one of the few for Jonathan, and you guys can always respond if it's a comment because super chats allow people to make comments as well as questions during the question and answer. You can respond, but you don't have to. This person says, any evidence that is not the fables of the Bible? I can stop this with a Genesis verse, but won't, as it will cause grumpy people.
Okay. Okay. Um, I'm aware that some apologists like to use some of the secondary or tertiary some of the external secular sources, such as Flavius Josephus, who in volume 18 and volume 20 of Antiquities of the Jews mentions Jesus of Nazareth. And there's a famous passage in volume 18 of Antiquities called the Testimonium Flavianum, which is famously contested as to the degree to which it's been interpolated by a later overzealous Christian scribe. The section in volume 20, which deals with the martyrdom of James, the brother of Jesus, is more widely accepted as genuine. Cornelius Tacitus, writing about 110 AD, also mentions Jesus in connection with the persecution of Christians under the Emperor Nero following the Great Fire that broke out in Rome in AD 64 that Nero blamed the Christians for. There's also Pliny the Younger, who mentions Jesus in connection with his letter to the Emperor Trajan, asking advice on how best to interrogate Christians. I personally don't make that a part of my case for historicism because, to me, it only really demonstrates that they had a familiarity with what Christians in the first and early second century were saying, and we already know that from the New Testament, so it doesn't really add much to the argument, in my opinion. However, we do one way that you can argue from external secular sources is to argue for points of contact between the Gospels or Acts and external secular sources, which actually can illuminate or corroborate details in those historical documents. For instance, take an example in Mark. Let's go to Mark chapter 10. In Mark chapter 10, we have Jesus giving teaching on divorce, and it says in verse 10, in the house, the disciples asked him again about this matter, and he said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. And this, of course, raises a question that a lot of skeptics bring up, namely, the Jewish law made no provision for a man to divorce, made provision for a man to divorce his wife, but not provision for a wife to divorce her husband. And so it's often supposed or proposed that that Mark here betrays his ignorance of Jewish law, and he's in fact a Gentile, or perhaps he's deliberately fudging Jesus' teaching to make it more suitable for a Roman audience where a female can initiate divorce proceedings. But it turns out that if you look at the historical context of what was going on at that time, Flavius Josephus reports that Herodias took it upon herself to confound the laws of her country, to divorce her first husband, namely Philip, in order to marry Herod Antipas. So Philip was the younger brother of Herod Antipas. And where was Herod Antipas tetrarch? He was tetrarch of Galilee, the very place where Jesus gave that teaching. And so historical points of contact between the Gospels and external secular sources can act as verifications of the Gospel account.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. Next up, appreciate your patience, folks. I'm skipping around here like a chicken with its head cut off. Okay, fair enough. Here we go with the next one. Let's see. Uncivil Skeptic, thanks for your support. They said like and sub to support the channel. And I'd say if you're like, ooh, I can't quite do super chats for one reason or another, one way of supporting the stream is just liking it, as it's also kind of helping get the word out about the Children's Burn Fund. So we again have that linked in the description. And so thanks for that encouragement. Holy Skepticism said thanks for donating to a good cause. Well, thank you for donating to a good cause. Thanks for your super chat, Michael Dresden. They said, okay, so some of these things, this is where atheist pastor, you don't have to respond, or if you want to take a jab at them. Michael Dresden says this is why internet atheism is a joke.
A lot of internet atheism is a joke. I agree. it's probably more frustrating for us on the atheist side than those who aren't. But there's also some good stuff, and just because you don't agree with something doesn't mean you need to, I guess, disrespect the person's right to hold that view.
Gotcha. Thanks very much. Next up, Skeptic Wiz. Thanks for your super chat. They said Richard Carrier is not, in all capital letters, a primary source. I don't know if anybody.
I agree.
Did
He's
someone
definitely
say
not a
that?
primary source.
Gotcha.
But no, it's I don't think anyone ever suggested that.
Gotcha.
Maybe he meant credible source.
We'll disagree on that one.
Very, very clever, Jonathan.
We'll disagree on that one.
It's a little zinger in there. Uncivil Skeptic, thanks for your super chat. They said Jesus mythicism equals atheist fundamentalism. Some of these are aggressive.
That's fine. Look, it's, to me, whether or not a historical person called Jesus existed, it actually doesn't affect my lack of belief in. Well, sorry, I won't say it doesn't affect my lack of belief, because it'd be, I guess, one step closer to a belief that there is something, that there is a God, because it would confirm a part of it. But really, it's if the evidence is presented, I'm happy. I'm not holding a view that my mind can't be changed. It's my view is I just haven't seen enough evidence. So if someone out there wants to call me a fundamentalist, good luck. Present me with the evidence and change my mind.
Gotcha. Appreciate that. Next up, thanks for your question, Duncan Reed. They said 100% funds from Super Chats will help burn victims. That's right, and thanks for your donation. Next up, Stupid Horror Energy said, there's an entire section on the contemporary sources for Alexander the Fabulous on his Wikipedia. I don't know if she's trolling or serious. Can you tell?
Trolling.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Let's see. Ali B, thanks for your super chat. They said best debate channel on YouTube's. Thanks for that. I don't know if that's true, but we appreciate your kind words. They said keep it up, James. Happy New Year when it comes. Appreciate that. Thanks for your support. Arnie Rorvik, thanks for your super chat. They said for James's jacket, the Adonis of fabric and content. That's very sweet of you. This is I appreciate that. You get this from the thrift shop. You'd be surprised what you can get at the thrift shop. Holy skepticism. Thanks for your super chat. Serious, great deals. They said, agreed, Jesus mythicism is atheist. Okay, it's got another one. Atheist fundamentalism. That's the last one of that I'm gonna read. That one kind of, somebody started, got duplicates. But you can respond atheist pastor, or you can ignore them.
That's fine. If people want to call me a fundamentalist, that's up to them. I'm not too fussed. People can call me whatever they like.
Gotcha. I appreciate your stoic personality. Let's see. Digital Demonic Davros. Hopefully I pronounced that right. Let me know if I didn't. Thanks for your super chat donation. They said, any evidence that is not... Oh, we got that one. That's embarrassing. Stupid Horror Energy. That's how she likes to call herself. Don't ask me. She says, I bet 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 8, is an interpolation. Don't at me. I don't understand that. But so she is... For some reason, she thinks 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8 is an interpolation. Jonathan, any words for Sarah?
Yeah, absolutely. Provide me with some evidence. I'm not aware of a single manuscript where 1 Corinthians 15 is missing. And so you would have to demonstrate that there's some evidence for that.
Gotcha. Appreciate that.
So what you're saying is she would need to provide the evidence because she's made the claim?
Right, exactly.
Okay, just wanted to clear that up. Yeah, cool.
Gotcha. Appreciate that. Thanks, Stephen Steen, up to his own trollish ways, as always. He says, this is why mythicism is the young earth creationism of atheism. So you don't have to respond to that. He's going for blood. You don't have to give...
I actually like that. I'll give credit. That's quite funny. I like that.
Very nice. General Ballsack, thank you. I'm sorry. Okay, thanks for your question. They said, atheist pastor, what do you consider a primary source in the ancient world?
Something that is a contemporary writing. So I guess an example would be Herodotus writing the histories. That would be a contemporary account and a primary source for the Peloponnesian War. Say a coin with Julius Caesar's head on it would be a contemporary. Sorry, it's very early in the morning here. That would be a primary source. Something that's a physical source, of course, something like that.
Gotcha.
For
Thanks.
examples, yeah.
Thanks very much. Next up, Sentinel Apologetics. He has 3, I think these are all quotes from, nope, they're not. They're 3 different scholars. One is from John Crossan, so John Dominic Crossan, in other words. In his book, Jesus, a Revolutionary Biography, boldly states, quote, that he was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be. Your thoughts, atheist pastor?
Was he there?
Gotcha.
That's an opinion. I can drag expert opinions that disagree. Just because someone has claims that they believe something doesn't make it true. Him saying that it happened and it's beyond doubt. Okay, cool. We'll present me with that evidence so I can have the same view that it's beyond doubt.
Just a quick comment on just one of the previous questions that compared mythicism to young Earth creationism. Well, that's a classic Ken Ham question. Was he there? Were he there? Just making that.
Yeah,
I mean, just because someone
I was being a bit cheeky with that one. Don't worry.
That's funny. Very nice. Thanks for your.
Well picked up, by the way.
We Sentinel Apologetics sent 2 other scholar quotes. I can bundle these, and then Atheist Pastor, if you want to read them, or I should say respond to them. And I'm going to read them right now. One is, question for the atheist. What is your response to the fact that Marcus Borg, in his book Jesus, A New Vision, also lists Jesus' execution as, quote unquote, the most certain fact about the historical Jesus? And well, maybe we'll just do these separately because they're technically separate points.
I haven't read it. I'm not familiar with that person. I'm not arguing as to whether they're someone who is qualified. I've never heard of them, so I can't comment on it.
Gotcha. Appreciate that. Next up, thanks for your super chat from Sentinel Apologetics again. They said, Reginald Fuller, another scholar, says that, quote, within a few weeks after the crucifixion, Jesus' disciples came to believe that this is one of the indisputable facts of history. Oh, I'm sorry. Technically, they said that within a few weeks after the crucifixion, Jesus' disciples came to believe this is one of the undisputable facts of history. Okay, I did read it right the first time. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, according to something that was written 40 years later.
Gotcha. Appreciate that. Next up, appreciate your super chat from Vibrant Brantley. Glad to see you, Vibrant Brantley. He's been hanging around here for a while. He says, I just want everyone to know my stance is not burning children. Very funny. So what basically appreciated that, Vibrant Brantley. The Children's Burn Fund is, you could say, the children's rehabilitation, the Children's Burn Rehabilitation Fund. So very funny, Vibrant Brantley. Glad to have you here, bud. By the way, yesterday I used the soundboard. I don't know if anybody noticed this, but I died of laughter. I used the soundboard right as Wotan was laughing, and it perfectly synced with his own laugh. I think it was this one. No, not that one. This one. That was it. That one. And so anyway, it made Wotan sound crazy. We love him. Wotan, if you're watching, we hope you're doing well. Next question. Appreciate your question from Slam RN. She says, what is Atheist Pastor's area of history?
Primarily, modern Australian.
Gotcha.
So, which isn't what we're talking about, but I had studied a bachelor in theology and ministry. I didn't complete them, so I'll throw my hands up for that. I deconverted before I could finish them. So I am familiar with, I am familiar with the theology.
Gotcha. Appreciate that. Stupid Whore Energy, thanks for your question. She said, here, I'll actually quote it. Must have missed something. This must have been one of your earlier chats, Sarah. But she's quoting something that she previously referred to. She says contemporaries who wrote accounts of Alexander the Great's life, including Callisthenes, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing these, Ptolemy and Nearchus, Aristobulus, and Onesicritus. I think that's referring to her past super chat in which she said there's an entire section on contemporary sources for Alexander the Fabulous on his Wikipedia. Oh, okay. So I think she's saying like, hey, we have better evidence to believe in Alexander because we have more contemporary sources. And then that last super chat was listing contemporary sources. How do you like them apples, Jonathan?
I'm not aware of any extant contemporary sources of Alexander the Great. So, what are the sources that you have?
Gotcha. Thank you for your super chat, Sentinel Apologetics. So he was the one that quoted those three scholars before Marcus Berg, John Dominic Crossan, and Reginald Fuller. He says, none of these scholars I quoted are Christian. If you want to respond, you can. Atheist Pastor, you don't have to.
Look, it's once again, I'm not arguing that what the majority view is. I know that mythicism is the minority view. It's the view I've come to based on the evidence that I've got presented in front of me. Different historians have different views. There's on pretty much any topic, you'll always struggle to find a consensus. I mean, even biblical scholars struggle to find a consensus. That's why there's so many different denominations of Christianity, and that's looking at the same source, the Bible. So it's, if you can find me any field in history where everyone agrees unanimously, I would be very, very surprised.
Gotcha.
I think historians think that history exists.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, there's your unanimous agreement.
Okay. And what area?
It's a joke.
Yeah, okay. I wasn't sure. I've had a few today, so it's still pretty early for me.
Gotcha. Well, we appreciate that you have gotten up early with us. If I've missed any questions, forgive me, folks. I think I've gotten all of them. One more just came in. Sentinel Apologetics, he's coming after you. He says, debate conceded. Mythicism is bunk. Thank you. So if
awesome.
you
provide me with the evidence. It's a pretty simple thing. My position is, if I'm provided with the evidence, I'm happy to change my view. It's not a religious belief for me as to whether Jesus existed or not. Provide me with the evidence, and I'll change my mind. But I haven't been presented with the evidence.
That's what we've been doing over the last 90 minutes.
I think we've got a different idea on what's been presented, but no, I haven't been presented with any evidence.
Gotcha. Well, we appreciate you guys being here. Appreciate everybody's super chat donations. We will put that receipt on Twitter just for full transparency and record keeping. And so if you don't have Twitter and you want to see the receipt to know that we are actually keeping our promise, shoot me an email at moderndaydebate@gmail.com, and I will send it to you, even if it's your first time here, no problemo. We are glad to have you all. So thanks again to our speakers, though, Atheist Pastor Jonathan and Calon. It's been a pleasure to have you.
It's been fun.
It's been good fun. I actually have enjoyed it. It's been good fun.
Absolutely. So thanks for coming by, folks. I hope you take care. We will see you soon as we've got more debates coming up. And wait, actually, a couple really quick house cleaning things. So Vosh is still interested in debating. However, as you may have heard, Hovind has backed out. Doesn't want to debate in the tour anymore. Sargon of Akkad is mulling it over. So, I mean, I probably shouldn't have even said that. But it's exciting that we might host that debate in place of the Vosh versus Hovind debate. And then we are excited that Nathan Thompson and Team Skeptic will be debating face-to-face in Dallas. That will be another live stream one. And then we are currently, if you know of a place in Austin, like a church or any empty building, we are kind of still looking for venues in Austin. We're good for Dallas, but Austin we're kind of still in the air on. We're also looking for a creationist on, well, creationist or intelligent design to take on Aaron Ra. We've invited Jonathan McLatchie. Dr. Jonathan, he is actually going to be in South Africa. My guess is you're speaking that, so he can't make it. You're probably speaking. Is that what you're up to?
Yeah, I'm in South Africa doing a speaking tour at that time.
You bet. So we will hopefully, maybe we'll find a person who's an intelligent design proponent or a creationist, either one. So let us know. Shoot us an email if you get an idea. Otherwise, we have a Discord, thanks to Tony Designs and thanks to our dear friend MathPig as well. They've done a lot of hard work. They've helped a ton. We really appreciate that. And so Discord is another place where you might want to run that, basically, like, possibilities there. That would be excellent. So someone asked what the debate topics are. So Flat Earth for Nathan Thompson and Team Skeptic. And then Aaron Ra, it would either be creationism or intelligent design. I'm trying to negotiate theism, but I don't know if it's going to fit this time. Hovind, or I'm sorry, not Hovind, Bosch and Sargon, it would probably be, we're kind of like figuring out what that would be. That's like totally, like, Sargon's still mulling it over. It's kind of short notice, and so we don't feel like we're entitled to have him at all. Like, I don't want him to feel obligated, is what I'm trying to say, because it is really short notice. He's trying to mull it over. Trying to think of anything else. Tom Jump will actually be on the tour as well. McLatchie, Dr. Jonathan, have you debated T Jump before?
I have, and actually he's going to be traveling with me in Asia next summer to do a series of debates.
Wow, that's exciting.
Yep.
Really cool. So yeah, so T Jump will be on the tour as well. He'll be debating Jonathan Sheffield, so that'll be a lot of fun. And then, so yeah, thanks for everybody's encouragement. It's been a pleasure. And I'll look for this Bob Enyart. Thanks for that name, Flash Gordon. Appreciate the help. And with that, keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable, everybody. Take care.
Remember, the Force will be with you, always.